Hello everyone, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at Congress of Vienna Part 2 by Historia Civilis. Now we're getting into the actual negotiations. So without further ado, let's get going.
This is how the Congress of Vienna was organized. There was an 8-member central committee that would vote on the final treaty. This group included the 5 great powers, plus 3 secondary powers, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, who each had played an important role in the victory over Napoleon.
Yes, and Spain and Portugal's contributions are quite obvious considering the Peninsular War. It was their forces that assisted the British in driving out the French from the Iberian Peninsula. Sweden's contribution in military terms are quite low, although Sweden participated in almost every coalition against Napoleon. But Sweden's main contribution was, of course, in the form of Crown Prince Carl Johan, also known as Marshal Bernadotte, who had served Napoleon as a marshal for some time and brought with him experience and knowledge of both Napoleon and the inner workings of the Grande Armée, and in that way was a major contributor to the defeat of Napoleon. And that is why these 3 additional powers are included, even though they have all lost their former great power status for some time now.
But the 5 great powers agreed to cut out the Central Committee by negotiating informally among themselves. If the great powers could hammer out a consensus, they could steamroll the Central Committee and the rest of the Congress.
Yeah, and this is always how it was going to be, and nobody really had any illusions about the fact that this is what was going to happen. And the fact that they got a seat at the table at all is, quite good for them, even though they had few opportunities to present their points of view and make their interests known. Still, when you consider the fact that almost every country in Europe, including those countries that no longer existed, had sent representatives to Vienna, well, most of them are going to be cut out, and the full Congress with all of the nations will never meet at all. So, they all came to Vienna and mingled about without ever having a real say in matters. That's just how it was. But that's not to say that there weren't opportunities for many of these mid-rank and smaller powers to, forge diplomatic connections and stuff like that that would be useful in the future.
In the end, this was where the real power lay. Then there were a number of subcommittees, at least 12, that would go off to the side and debate isolated issues among themselves. When they reached a consensus, they would bring their proposal to the Central Committee for approval.
Yeah, and this is sort of how modern diplomacy still works. You have a number of issues, and you split up into groups and try to resolve each issue in turn in a smaller format, and then you bring it up for a higher level approval. And of course, in the end, world leaders sign some sort of treaty or deal, and by the time it has come to the signing stage, or where world leaders are meeting, there are only smaller details to be resolved often, because most of the groundwork is done by experienced and professional diplomats. Because if we let the politicians write world treaties, who knows where we'd end up.
Most of these subcommittees were pretty boring. Which countries had shipping rights in which rivers, stuff like that.
But it may be boring, but it was very important, the free navigation on rivers and such, which would become part of the final treaty.
But the most important subcommittee was the German Committee. This committee would be chaired by Metternich of Austria,
Of
and
course.
would have members from every German state in Central Europe, including Prussia. Together, the German states would go away and collectively decide what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. The negotiations that took place within the German Committee were perhaps the most consequential of the entire Congress.
Oh, without a doubt. This is where the foundation of the modern Germany we know today is laid. This is where it happens. The German Confederation that will result from the Congress of Vienna is the platform for which various people and in the future will try to form a united Germany from.
The first roadblock was that the diplomats couldn't agree upon which map to use as a baseline for negotiations. As I've said before, none of these maps accurately reflected what was going on the ground at the time. There were armies from every great power scattered all over Europe. The default map that Britain, Austria, and Russia wanted to use was the 1792 map with some minor modifications. In other words, they wanted the default map to be France as it existed before any of its revolutionary wars of conquest. France and Prussia favored using 1806 as a starting point. This was when Prussia was at its beefiest.
Yes, indeed. And why was that the case? Well, there had been a deal made between France and Prussia in late 1805, the so-called Convention of Schönbrunn, because it was signed at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. And the treaty basically said that Prussia would give up some of their territories along the Rhine and would allow them to be absorbed by France. And in compensation, Prussia would be allowed to annex the electorate of Hanover, which was the personal possession of George III, of course, since George III is of the so-called Hanoverian line of the British monarchy. He and his family had originally come from Hanover, and they actually ruled Hanover and Britain at the same time. So they were quite a bit miffed about this development. But in any case, it resulted in a very, very big Prussia, at least relative to what it had been before.
So obviously, the land-hungry Prussians would push for this date. Talleyrand backing Prussia's 1806 proposal was a shrewd move, because not only would it result in an extra beefy France, but more importantly, it allowed Talleyrand to open the Congress by throwing a wedge into the anti-French alliance. There was always the danger of the four great powers ganging up on a defeated France and taking from them whatever they wanted. Hardenberg of Prussia even spoke of partitioning France. But with Talleyrand at the table, that wasn't happening. By pulling Prussia away from the other great powers, Talleyrand was signaling to everybody that France was capable of making trouble, and if the other great powers wanted to reach a consensus, they would actually have to negotiate with France.
Yeah, so if you start with the 1806 map as a baseline, they know they're not going to be able to keep all of those gains, but it makes it possible to keep on more land, than they would with the 1792 map as a basis. So that was the Prussian motives. Now Talleyrand probably realized that the 1806 map was hopeless. It was never going to be accepted by the other great powers. However, like he just explained here, it will throw a wedge into the anti-French alliance by prying away Prussia. And that's what was his real objective in my mind. Talleyrand is smart, even though he is a cockroach.
Metternich and Castlereagh eventually talked Hardenberg down from his 1806 position. It's possible that they made certain informal promises regarding Prussian territorial expansion, but those details are lost to us.
Yes, the issue of Poland and Saxony is really the issue that will dominate the Congress of Vienna. It is the biggest sticking point for all involved. And this is the question that will almost bring the members of the Congress to another great war. Because after this question is resolved, the rest of the Congress runs along quite smoothly, and all the other extant issues are resolved in an amicable fashion. But this one was very difficult to resolve.
So it was decided that they would start with the old 1792 borders. But these brought with them a huge problem: Poland. A beefy Poland had existed in 1792.
Yes, and this is of course the remnants of the once mighty Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, at one point in perhaps the early 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth reached its territorial height, and it was truly a behemoth in European affairs. It was one of the greatest of the great powers at the time. But with the advent of the 18th century, things started to change for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They had a series of weak rulers, and the fact was that the Polish political system was dysfunctional as hell. In essence, one member of the Sejm, the Polish parliament, could veto any motion and disband parliament for that sitting. And that is what is known to history as the liberum veto. And although this kept a substantial check on the royal power, which made it impossible for Polish kings to exercise any sort of absolutism, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth started to decline, it also became more susceptible to foreign influences, especially from its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And what they started to do was they started to bribe politicians in the Polish parliament to use their incredible veto power to just grind business to a halt, prevent reforms, leave them susceptible to foreign invasions, and so on and so forth. So by 1792, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is for all intents and purposes already dead, but it does exist. It does exist because the final annexation doesn't happen until 1795. So now we have this big Poland here, and nobody knows how we're going to divide it up again, because Prussia and Austria and even Britain and France are not really that interested in seeing Russia creeping up on their borders. They really want some kind of buffer in place to keep Russia out of Central European affairs. And this is going to be problematic.
And if it were to be restored, it would come at the expense of Russia and Prussia. Prussia was land hungry and would not willingly let go of any of its Polish provinces without being compensated somewhere else.
Now, keep in mind, these Polish provinces aren't all that rich, and they're not worthless, of course. They bring population and resources, but not a whole lot. And so Austria and Prussia are willing to give it up in exchange for some compensation. Of course, Prussia is the one who wants compensation. Metternich is fine with giving up his Polish provinces. But Russia wants it all.
Russia didn't want Poland to exist at all, since it would serve as nothing more than a buffer between it and Central Europe. Metternich loved the idea of restoring Poland. Not only would it keep Russia out of Central Europe, but it would push Russia back from the Austrian border.
Now, Metternich has long been concerned about the creeping power and influence of Russia, and he doesn't want Russia anywhere close to Central Europe, because the closer they are, the more they can interfere. And that's why Metternich offered several peace terms to Napoleon that will allow him to keep his throne and keep France pretty large. They would be allowed to keep a lot of their territorial gains throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Ultimately, Napoleon was not susceptible to this sort of peace negotiations. He always saw them as humiliating. But there was a reason that Metternich kept giving France somewhat lenient terms, because he wanted France to serve as a check on Russia. And he still wants to do this, and he'll just have to accomplish it by other means. And reforming Poland is one idea.
Metternich was even willing to give up Austria's Polish-speaking provinces to make this happen. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled Hardenberg aside and came to a preliminary agreement over Poland. Prussia would give up its Polish-speaking provinces, but Castlereagh and Metternich promised to compensate for this with German-speaking provinces in Central Europe. The three of them came to a handshake agreement that Prussia would receive Saxony, along with several German cities to the west. Under this framework, Prussia's population would increase by 6%, and Poland would remain independent.
Yes, and these lands, of course, are much more resource rich than the Polish provinces are. And so even though the Polish provinces was a significant chunk of land, these lands were better for Prussia overall. So, yeah, this is a pretty good deal for Prussia. Unfortunately, it's not going to be that simple. Now, as you can see, Prussia has also, in this scenario, been given a lot of land in the west, very close to the French border, and that is on purpose. Castlereagh was especially insistent on Prussia accepting these territorial gains, because then they would be right on the French border to serve as a check on France in the future. And so here you see again the greater ambitions, the greater geopolitical objectives of the British, for example.
All three were happy with this. When Tsar Alexander of Russia caught wind of this secret agreement, he threw a pretty public tantrum. He announced that he intended to keep 100% of Poland, including the Polish-speaking provinces currently held by Austria and Prussia. These demands were extreme, and it was difficult to imagine Austria and Prussia simply handing their territory over to Russia for nothing. Talleyrand was also unhappy with the secret Poland agreement and went to see Tsar Alexander privately. Talleyrand specifically wanted to preserve a strong and independent Saxony, since France and Saxony had traditionally been strong allies. Talleyrand made his pitch to the Russian emperor. Alexander replied, "I would rather have war than give up what I occupy." Talleyrand was stunned when he heard this and asked for clarification. "Yes, I would rather have war," Alexander said. Talleyrand began trying to talk the emperor down into a compromise, but before he could make any progress, Alexander stood up and declared, "It's time for the theater. I have to go." He then gave Talleyrand an affectionate hug and ran off.
Now, if this was a professional diplomat, adopting a maximalist position, like keeping 100% of Poland, is a viable negotiation tactic, because if you adopt a maximalist position, then you can be talked down, quote unquote, to the position you're really willing to accept, perhaps 50% or whatever the number is. And that is fine. The problem is here, Alexander I is not a professional diplomat. And he is not adopting a maximalist position as a negotiation tactic. He really wants 100% of Poland at this stage of the negotiations. And the other great powers simply cannot accept that, because not only would they lose territory, the balance of power, which is the whole point of this Congress, would be severely disrupted by a super expansionist Russia creeping into European affairs like this.
After casually threatening a world war, the Russian emperor stayed out partying until 4 in the morning.
Of course it did.
Talleyrand was appropriately alarmed at this behavior and informed the other great powers of Russia's intransigence. Hardenberg began to fear that Prussia may be on the losing end of a conflict over Poland, so he began to move soldiers around to fortify the parts of Poland that they currently occupied. As if that isn't bad enough, Metternich then found out that his monarch was upset with him. The Austrian Emperor Francis summoned Metternich and chastised him for using the Kingdom of Saxony as a bargaining chip. Austria was trying to position itself internationally as the defender of the rule of law and the defender of the rights of smaller Central European states. They couldn't credibly do this if they sold their neighbors up the river at first opportunity.
Yeah, and as the guardian of the traditional order, one must consider that the Kingdom of Saxony is ancient. And the fact is, it is ruled by a certain dynasty with a certain bloodline. And if we allow Prussia to suddenly annex all of Saxony, well then, what is the point of having royal bloodlines at all? If it is not to preserve all of these ancient kingdoms and duchies and principalities. And this is a problem for Metternich, that his monarch is really insistent on this matter. Metternich is a realist, and he doesn't see the same problem with this. He sees this as a solution to the predicament they are in. A realistic solution, and it was on paper a realistic solution. But there are more motives around than just pure geopolitics, as we will soon, we've already found out that you cannot simply negotiate in a vacuum, if you get my meaning here. There are other factors at play, and this objection from the Austrian emperor is one of them.
Emperor Francis told Metternich that the Kingdom of Saxony must survive the negotiations, and it must survive at least half of its current size.
Yeah, and it must survive at a certain size, because otherwise you can't really call the Saxony a kingdom anymore, can we? And you can't really demote a sitting king to what, a duke? And that is unacceptable, and it would set a pretty bad precedent if that was allowed to happen.
This made Metternich's task infinitely more complex. Prussia must be convinced to take less of Saxony than they had been promised in their handshake deal. This meant that they would want to hold on to their Polish-speaking provinces. In order to make that work, Metternich would need to strike a deal with Tsar Alexander.
Yeah, I don't envy his task.
Metternich went to meet with Alexander, and things got heated. Metternich did not find the Russian emperor particularly intimidating, and spoke to him in the manner that he would speak to any other diplomat. Alexander wasn't really used to that, and after 2 long hours of back and forth, he jumped to his feet, marched over to Metternich, and challenged him to a duel. This kind of thing was above Metternich's pay grade,
Oh boy.
and required the personal intervention of the Austrian emperor. Francis of Austria soothed Alexander's ego by saying that of course he would win a duel against Metternich, but murdering the Austrian foreign minister might cause an international incident.
Might.
Recall Metternich's first impression of Alexander, the biggest baby on earth. Was he wrong?
No.
After this incident, Alexander would privately describe Metternich as, quote, a permanent obstacle and, quote, a sworn enemy. The feeling was mutual. Russia was apparently a dead end, so Metternich went to Prussia next. Metternich explained to Hardenberg that he could now only give Prussia half of Saxony. This was not what they had agreed to, and Hardenberg was understandably upset. The 2 diplomats parted ways with sore feelings and no agreement. The entire deal over Poland seemed to be dead, or at least dying, and the prospect of war with Russia was becoming a growing concern. In desperation, Metternich brought Britain and France into the negotiations. He thought that if 3 great powers could bring a compromise to the other 2, they might be pressured into accepting it. Castlereagh went to see Alexander. He explained to the Russian Tsar that Britain would not accept a Poland under Russian domination. The British public demanded an independent Poland. Alexander finally let his guard down, or at least pretended to, and confessed to Castlereagh that the war with Napoleon had left him in a precarious situation back in Russia. The Russians had sacrificed everything to defeat Napoleon, and the Russian aristocracy felt that they deserved Poland as a reward. Alexander doesn't come right out and say this, but he hints that he had promised them exactly that before he left. The implication was that there may be a coup if he went back empty-handed.
And coups in Russia are not at all unusual. In fact, it's a tradition at this point. And Alexander's father had been deposed and killed in a palace coup. And there had been many more Russian Tsars before that who had been deposed and often suffered a, how should we say, deadly fate. So this could be a legitimate concern from Alexander. And I'm not sure if this story is true or if his implication is correct. But it could also just be that Alexander concocted this story as an excuse for him adopting such a maximalist position. Who knows, really, but it is no doubt, in my mind at least, that Alexander personally felt, that he and Russia deserved Poland, the entirety of Poland, as a prize for sacrificing so much in defeating Napoleon. Now remember, Alexander and Russia think of themselves as the main reason Napoleon was defeated, which is not true at all. There's no such thing as Russia being the only ones that opposed Napoleon. All of Europe were united against him. So yeah, we have a pretty bad situation here, where nobody seems to be able to come down from the high horse.
Castlereagh explained to Alexander that if he took Poland without the consent of the other great powers, it would not end well for him. Prussia and Austria would become permanent enemies of Russia and natural allies to the occupied Polish population. One way or another, Poland would be free. It seemed that negotiations were approaching an impasse. And then disaster struck. News got out that the Prussian king had publicly signed off on the Russian annexation of Poland. Tsar Alexander had been personally negotiating with him in secret. Hardenberg was inconsolable. His own king had just stabbed him in the back.
Now, King Frederick William III is not what I would call the sharpest knife in the box. He is very indecisive, or was very indecisive, and it really was not beneficial for Prussia during this time. He was about to join the war against Napoleon with the Third Coalition. Then he heard of Austerlitz, decided to back off, and then he had to be convinced by his ministers that war was the only honorable cause, and yada yada, And he was very much reliant on advisors, especially his wife. But when Queen Louise died, as Napoleon termed it, he had lost his greatest minister. And this is sort of a prime example of this, where he has been duped by Alexander I, of all people, into signing off on the Prussian annexation of Poland, without realizing, it seems at least, the greater implications here. And I understand Hardenberg's feelings here.
It was humiliating. What made matters worse was that the Prussian king was too stupid to realize he wasn't helping.
Yeah, I mean, the king appointed Hardenberg to lead the negotiations. Now he's gotta let him lead the negotiations on behalf of Prussia, not making backroom deals without informing him. And yeah, it's pretty bad.
This turn of events lit a fire under the members of the Congress. Castlereagh grabbed Hardenberg and said that if Hardenberg could get the Prussian king to walk back those Poland comments, then Britain would be prepared to back Prussia's demand to annex 100% of Saxony. Hardenberg agreed and marched off to wrestle back control of his monarch. Metternich stayed strategically silent during this exchange. He had secretly written to Castlereagh and promised Austrian support in this scheme, even though it was in direct violation of his emperor's instructions to preserve at least half of Saxony.
The Metternich is walking a fine line here. He is not openly defying the will of his monarch, but, if the other great powers all agree that Saxony should be annexed, well, I can't do anything about that, can I? That's sort of the line he's walking right now. Trying to play innocent in all of this, while secretly making these backroom deals.
But that was a problem for another day. And just like that, because of Russian overreach, Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria were all on the same page when it came to Poland. It was 4 against 1. With newfound urgency, the 4 powers came together and drafted 3 possible options to resolve the Poland crisis. Option number 1 called for an enlarged Poland, which would include the Polish-speaking provinces from Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Option number 2 called for a reduced Poland, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia each held on to their Polish-speaking provinces. Option number 3 called for a full partition, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia would come in and divide Poland 3 ways. Under this plan, the people of Poland would have certain political protections across all 3 countries.
Yeah, right. Those political protections might exist on paper, but they wouldn't really exist. At least not in Russia. And here you can see a problem with the Congress of Vienna. There is absolutely no consideration of ethnicity and nationality and all of this. It's all about territory. And this is a problem we will see in the Congress of Berlin in the 1880s, when the European powers divided Africa, there was no consideration taken to ethnic boundaries or nationality, and they just drew lines on a map, and you know, because they factored in territory, resources, stuff like that, and that would lead to very serious repercussions that we feel to this day. In Africa, for example, where you see constant ethnic conflicts and clashes, much is due to the fact that the borders have been drawn in a terrible way. And the same thing is going to happen with Poland here, where there's going to be multiple uprisings against Russian rule primarily. And and this is not limited to Poland. We will see the same in Italy and stuff like that. So yeah, it's one of the, I wouldn't call it failures of the Congress, but it's one of the problems that gets left behind even after the Congress successfully concludes. These, especially when nationalism is going to be on the rise in a few decades here. And that will result in the 1848 revolution, which we will cover some other time. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on this matter.
You might notice that there was no option in which Russia got to keep all of Poland. That was on purpose. Talleyrand was selected to go and present these options to the Russian Tsar. He explained to Alexander that France's official position was that there should be an independent Poland. He said that if Russia acted on its own and annexed Poland, Prussia and Austria would have no choice but to seriously consider a potential war with Russia. In such a scenario, both would seek to strengthen themselves through territorial expansion. If three of the great powers were going around Europe gobbling up territory, France and Britain would have no choice but to intervene. Talleyrand was very clear with Alexander. If he took Poland by force, the great powers would go to war. Alexander was growing frustrated with this constant diplomatic meddling, and finally snapped. I have 200,000 men in the Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, and I would like to see anyone try to drive me out of it.
Now, Alexander I actually has a point here. If matters really came to a head, Austria and Prussia are not really in a good position to do anything about this. Certainly not France, who is completely exhausted by 25 years of war. And Britain doesn't have a great land army to begin with. Most they could do is blockade St. Petersburg. And that would be that. And provide financial aid, of course, as they've done before. But a war would not end favorably for any side. And that is why everyone is so eager to avoid a direct confrontation.
I have given Prussia Saxony, and Austria consents to it. Alexander had spies everywhere, and apparently he knew that Saxony was secretly being used as a bargaining chip.
Oh yeah, you can't keep anything secret. When you have so many diplomats and delegates all gathered in Vienna, who knows what amount of gossip and rumors went around, over dinners and stuff like that. So it would have been very hard to keep something like that secret.
Talleyrand feigned innocence and asked an innocent question. How could Prussia annex Saxony when they had no claim to the Saxon throne?
Talleyrand also knows about this, of course. Talleyrand has a network of his own. But he's asking a good, innocent question, and this is the problem that the Austrian emperor highlighted for Metternich before, that since Prussia has no claim to the Saxon throne, they cannot annex all of Saxony. It's against everything, against the traditional order to do such a thing. Doing such a thing would make them no better than Napoleon, who kept placing his relatives with no royal bloodlines on the various thrones of Europe.
Alexander responded, "If the King of Saxony will not abdicate, he will be packed off to Russia. He will die there." This was an open threat of violence against
Oh my,
another
indeed.
monarch, and it was not the answer that Talleyrand was expecting. After a pause, he responded with caution. The Congress was not assembled to witness a violent assault of this kind. At this, Alexander truly lost his temper. "Do you really think I give much weight to all your parchments and treaties?"
What Alexander the First is saying there is, might makes right. I don't care what it says on a stupid piece of paper. And in a sense, he's right. In many ways, might does make right. And it's not the end-all be-all, but certainly a large part of it.
"The King of Prussia will be the King of Prussia and Saxony, just as I will be the Emperor of Russia and the King of Poland." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Talleyrand alone with his thoughts. When Metternich learned of Alexander's outburst, he finally lost his patience. He decided to meet once more with the Russian Tsar, this time with a different negotiating tactic. He told Alexander that Austria was considering unilaterally selecting a Polish king to rule over an independent Poland. This was an unspoken threat. Metternich was telling Alexander that all he had to do was snap his fingers, and Poland would rise up against Russian occupation.
He's not wrong. That is certainly a way to do it. It's a very unfriendly way of doing it. But anti-Russian sentiments among Poles was very high back then, and it's still very high now. And selecting a Polish king, a rallying figure for the Polish people, and then perhaps providing them with the arms and supplies needed to fight a rebellion, would cause a lot of problems for Russia, because there would undoubtedly be guerrilla warfare going on. You wouldn't have symmetrical warfare, you would have asymmetrical warfare. And, well, this is a powerful threat from Metternich, but one that should not be made lightly.
Alexander responded by issuing an unspoken threat of his own. He invited Metternich to come to Poland and inspect the Russian soldiers stationed there, all 200,000 of them. Metternich then dropped the subtlety. He flatly told Alexander that if he took Poland, the entire Congress of Vienna would be against him. After this, tempers flared, voices were raised, and things got personal. From this moment on, Metternich would refuse to be in the same room with the Russian Tsar unless others were present, which frankly is exactly the kind of grudge that I respect. And then a very troubling thing happened. Without notice, the Russian soldiers in Saxony began to pull back and leave. Shortly after this, the Prussian soldiers occupying parts of Poland did the same. All of a sudden, there was a lot of military movement, and nobody knew why. Within a matter of weeks, a lot more Prussian soldiers entered Saxony, and a lot more Russian soldiers entered Poland. It became clear that there was some kind of handoff happening, a secret agreement between Russia and Prussia. Both were openly fortifying their positions and preparing for war. Bad, bad, bad. Castlereagh wrote a summary of these events to Prime Minister Liverpool back in Britain. Quote, "Unless the Emperor of Russia can be brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct, the peace, which we have so dearly purchased, will be but of a short duration. You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary, as another Bonaparte."
That is a very powerful statement by the Viscount of Castlereagh. I love the first passage here about the emperor being brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct. That's basically him saying that he's a freaking idiot and a madman. But yeah, resist him as another Bonaparte. That is, considering all the expenses and efforts that have been made against Bonaparte, that is quite a statement to make.
Back in Britain, the domestic political situation was approaching a boiling point. The narrow conservative Whig majority in the House of Commons was in jeopardy. The liberal Whig opposition had weaponized the Saxony and Poland crisis and were using it as a rallying cry against authoritarianism everywhere.
Yeah, so liberals across Europe for decades to come will continue to rally for Poland's restoration and independence. It almost becomes a symbol against absolute monarchy and would really be at the forefront of the 1848 revolutions, even though nothing came out of it. The cause of Poland was still being used by then as a rallying cry against authoritarianism and absolutism. So it's quite interesting how this Poland question continued to flare up every now and again, especially among liberals.
The liberals had the public on their side, and now they were calling for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland, with no concessions to the other powers whatsoever. Liverpool was in a precarious situation, and could not appear to be throwing the people of Poland to the Russian wolves, or bears or whatever. The liberals wanted to paint Liverpool as sympathetic to the Russian tyrant, and so Liverpool needed to prove them wrong. He wrote to Castlereagh, instructing him to back away from any deal that would partition Saxony or Poland. The official British position would now call for full independence for both countries. You would think that such an abrupt shift in priorities would blow up the negotiations, but it really didn't. After being stabbed in the back by Russia and Prussia, Metternich felt no obligation to bend over backwards for them anymore. The Austrian emperor had always wanted an independent Saxony, and Metternich had always wanted an independent Poland, so he joined the British in calling for both. Talleyrand had always favored full independence for both countries, and quickly followed Metternich's lead.
Yeah, at this point, these three powers are getting really tired of the Prussian and Russian antics. And now they just sort of made up their mind that, well, if you're not going to accept any compromise, then let's have no compromise then. Let's have a full independence for Poland and Saxony. And this is sort of where Russia and Prussia starts to realize that sort of need to climb down from their high horses here and really starts negotiating.
This audacious show of force from Russia and Prussia spooked every small and medium-sized state in Central Europe. If Saxony could get steamrolled like this, nobody was safe. Virtually every Central European state found their courage and backed Castlereagh and Metternich's call for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland. Austria had long sought to position itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law, and now that strategy was paying off. Metternich suddenly found himself at the center of attention, the most popular guy in Vienna, the hub to which every Central European state wanted to attach itself.
Oh, and you can bet Metternich loved this. He was very prominent at social gatherings, let's just call it that. He was had a keen interest in women and parties, and I'm sure he was absolutely delighted. But in the grand scheme of things, this is the Austrian geopolitical strategy working out. Spending all the times fostering relations with those smaller and mid-ranked powers is now paying off, since they are joining in against great powers like Prussia and Russia, which is really courageous of them, by the way. And yeah, this is going to put immense pressure on Alexander and Hardenberg to start negotiating, like I just said.
When the dust settled, it became clear that Russia and Prussia's power grab had been a massive blunder. Tsar Alexander must have realized that he had backed himself into a corner.
Yeah, it was. How can I describe it? They played to win, and if they won, they would have won massively. But if they failed, well, yeah, it's going to look really bad for them. It's basically blown up in their faces at this point.
Because he began sending signals to Austria that he might be satisfied with less than 100% of Poland. This was exactly the sort of opening that everyone was waiting for. Attention then turned to Prussia. There were reports that Prussia was building fortifications inside of occupied Saxony, which drew broad international condemnation. It soon became conspicuous that Tsar Alexander was remaining silent. Prussia was being left hanging out to dry. A desperate Hardenberg visited Talleyrand and tried to get him to break away from the other powers by making wild promises. At one point, Hardenberg offered France the Netherlands, which of course was a red line for Britain, and not something that Hardenberg was in a position to give away.
Yeah, that's fine on paper as an offer, but Hardenberg, it's not in his gift to give away the Netherlands to France. Prussia is the weakest of the great powers at this conference and have not really the political clout to make this move happen, especially not since Britain, who is ostensibly the most powerful of the great powers. This is a red line for them, so yeah, it was never going to happen, and Talleyrand is not stupid, he realizes this. And yeah, it was a desperate gamble by Hardenberg, and everyone knew it.
Talleyrand wisely turned him down. Hardenberg was out of options. He backed down from his maximalist position and began telling people that he would accept no less than half of Saxony. Metternich jumped at this. An independent Saxony at half of its current size would satisfy both the Austrian Emperor and all of those smaller Central European states. After some back and forth over specifics, an agreement was reached. Prussia would receive half of Saxony.
Yeah, I've seen other numbers saying that 3/5, alas 60%, of Saxony was given to Prussia, but I guess it depends on how you calculate the area and territory. But regardless, somewhere between 50 and 60% of Saxony was annexed. And Saxony, although greatly diminished, was still large enough that it could, legitimately qualify itself as a kingdom still.
Along with some German-speaking territory along the Rhine. A reduced Saxony would remain fully independent, and war would be averted. But then there was still the issue with Poland. Alexander reopened negotiations by offering to let Austria and Prussia keep their Polish-speaking provinces. A real change of tune from last time.
Really?
Castlereagh then called for the creation of a strong Polish constitution built upon liberal democratic values. Tsar Alexander immediately agreed and publicly thanked Castlereagh for his advocacy on behalf of the people of Poland.
Yeah, that's not something Alexander would say. If it's anything Russians hate, it's liberalism. And accepting a liberal constitution for Poland, I don't know about that. But yeah, clearly there's some sort of deal going on here. Or some sort of deal has happened already.
If you find Alexander's change in demeanor a little shocking, you aren't alone. It's clear that there were some back-channel talks going on during the Saxony crisis, and it seems that concessions were made in order to get Alexander to back off and throw Prussia under the bus. What was happening now over Poland seemed well choreographed, as if it had all been drawn up in some back room somewhere.
Well, everything in this conference is being drawn up in a back room, so if there are back rooms to the back rooms, that's not really surprising, is it?
The great powers quickly reached an agreement over Poland, and it looked like this. Austria and Prussia would be allowed to keep their Polish-speaking provinces. The rest would become the Kingdom of Poland. The new kingdom would have a strong liberal democratic constitution, with an independent legislature, independent courts, and an independent army. The King of Poland would be a quasi-ceremonial role, tightly constrained by the Polish constitution. Under this deal, it was decided that Tsar Alexander of Russia would separately and simultaneously become the King of Poland.
Yeah, this is a very convenient deal. I'm sure he'll mention it. But anyways, the one thing I want to mention here is that the Free City of Krakow was established too here. And Krakow became independent, but under the joint administration of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And it would remain so for a decade or two before finally it was done away with. But the Kingdom of Poland here that is created is known to history as Congress Poland. And while all of this looks fine on paper, I mean, you get a strong, independent Poland and all that, reality is not that simple. I'm sure he'll mention.
On paper, this satisfied the British and Austrian demands for an independent Poland.
That is what makes this deal convenient. You get a liberal Poland that the British will love, and as the King of Poland, Alexander can claim that he has gotten Poland in this peace deal.
Since the new kingdom retained the right to make its own laws and field its own military. It also satisfied Alexander's demand to take Poland as a prize for defeating Napoleon. But obviously, Poland could not be truly independent under this arrangement. With the Russian emperor as their king, it became impossible for Poland to resist creeping Russian influence. For the rest of Alexander's reign, he would chip away at Poland's independent political institutions and slowly work towards swallowing Poland into the Russian Empire.
Yeah, Congress Poland could never truly be independent. I mean, what is Poland going to do here at this point? Their armies are never going to be enough to withstand Russia, and they can't really count on help from anyone else, since this is technically the possession of Alexander. And yeah, it would really become very difficult for Congress Poland to retain its autonomy for very long. But, you know, it was probably the best deal that could have been done at this point. Looking at it from a greater point of view, it's of course very unfortunate for the Polish people, who would not have an independent state again until after World War I. But yeah, the Congress of Vienna is full of these sorts of unhappy compromises. It's a reality of diplomacy.
By the time his successor came to the throne, the new Russian emperor declared that he no longer felt bound by the Polish constitution. And then that was that. It's undeniable that Castlereagh and Metternich sacrificed Poland for an independent Saxony. Perhaps they saw the writing on the wall. The truth was that if Russia took Poland by force, Austria and Britain really weren't in a position to take it back. Perhaps they decided that if they couldn't stop Russia from taking Poland, they could turn the whole thing into a poison pill. As an island of liberalism within the Russian Empire, Poland would confound and distract Tsar Alexander for the rest of his reign.
That's quite ingenious. If that was a real intention, to make Congress Poland into a poison pill for Russia and Alexander, that is an ingenious idea, because it succeeded.
The Poland and Saxony crisis brought the great powers back to the brink of war. But now that there was a deal in place, messy as it was, there was finally room to breathe. One of the conditions attached to the Poland deal was that Tsar Alexander, having received his great prize, was to get out of the way and let everybody else negotiate what they came to negotiate.
This will make future negotiations very much a more smoother ride.
There were still several outstanding questions that needed to be settled, but none more pressing than the fate of the German-speaking states in Central Europe.
Hello everyone, this is to let you guys know that I've decided to split this video up into two due to the length of the video. So when you're done here, check out the second part of part 2 of this Congress of Vienna video, and I'll see you guys there.